So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to Geodiversity and Geoconservation Talks, the new webinar series from the UNESCO Chair in Geodiversity and Geoconservation. Based at the University of Minho in Portugal, the UNESCO Chair is supported by a network of 10 universities spanning different continents, as well as 2 international organizations. We are thrilled to have received more than 200 registrations from over 60 countries worldwide. This is a great start for this new initiative. Please keep your microphone muted at all times. The presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the Chair's YouTube channel later, but we will stop the recording as soon as the discussion begins. If you have a question or comment during the discussion period, please either type it in the chat window or raise your hand. To open this new webinar series, we are pleased to introduce Lisa Aylett, the IUCN World Heritage Outlook Coordinator. She will talk about the new edition of the IUCN World Heritage Outlook, focusing specifically on the state of conservation of geoheritage within UNESCO World Heritage properties. Thank you very much, Lisa. We are very happy to have you with us today, and you can start. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jose, and what a pleasure to see you all, and also to have the honor of being part of the first session. It's great. So yeah, as Jose mentioned, my name is Lisa Aylett. I work for the IUCN, and I'm specifically focusing on the World Heritage Outlook. So today I'd like to present to you what the Outlook is, and also the main results that we've just released, specifically on geoheritage sites, so the sites that have been inscribed and recognized for their geoheritage values. Just to say, I'm not a geoheritage expert. I am an expert on World Heritage sites and the World Heritage Outlook. But that's why it's great to be here and also to get your inputs and expertise, especially in the discussion after the presentation. So I really look forward to your insights. I hope everyone can see my screen. So maybe just to present a brief background on what Outlook is. So Outlook is an independent global snapshot evaluation of all World Heritage sites inscribed for their natural values. So those include natural and also mixed World Heritage sites. And Outlook was officially launched in 2014 and has since been updated in 2017, 2020, and at the end of 2025. And it is really the only global assessment of natural World Heritage at a single point in time. And the whole idea is that it complements the statutory monitoring processes under the World Heritage Convention. So under the convention, a proportion of all the natural World Heritage sites are regularly assessed through the statutory monitoring processes. However, a large proportion is also not regularly assessed because, for example, there are no pending issues that the convention or the committee has to explore. So the idea behind Outlook was to really capture what is going on in all of the natural World Heritage sites at a given point in time. And anything that comes through Outlook, for example, a new threat that has been discovered, does feed back into the World Heritage Convention statutory monitoring processes. So just to look at the objectives of Outlook. So overall, what we're aiming to do with Outlook is to track the state of conservation of all World Heritage sites inscribed for their natural values over time, to recognize well-managed sites, but also to identify where there are pressing conservation issues and what actions might be useful to remedy these. At the same time, we're also capturing the benefits of World Heritage sites, which is an interesting component. So Outlook is based on a standardized methodology. I think this is really important to highlight. This was developed in 2011 and was tested by an IUCN-led technical advisory group. And it really draws on a wide range of existing methodologies for protected area assessments, especially ones that focus on the effectiveness of protection and management. And ultimately, the underlying assessment framework has remained the same since 2014. And that's really important to allow for this consistency and comparability of data between the Outlook cycles. But at the same time, we do try and refine the methodology between the Outlook cycles based on feedback during the assessment cycle and from the methodology review group. What I thought was interesting just to mention here is that following the 2020 Outlook assessment cycle, we made a few amendments. So we refined the methodology, and one of these is capturing other important values. And I think this is really important for the geoheritage space because many sites that have been inscribed, for example, for their biodiversity or other ecological processes, have not been officially recognized under the convention for their geoheritage values. And so what we've done through Outlook is we've enabled more of a consistent capturing of geoheritage values in sites that potentially have not been recognized for these officially under the World Heritage Convention. However, it's also important to note, and I'll get into this in the next few slides, that the other important values don't impact the overall conservation outlook of a site because that is purely focused on the World Heritage values for which a site has been inscribed for. Some of the other changes that we made to the methodology was updating the threat categories based on the IUCN threat taxonomy, the IUCN Red List threat taxonomy. We also spent a bit of time with our IUCN Green List team to align the protection and management section of the Outlook assessment to the IUCN Green List standard. We've also started including overlapping international designations in the assessment, and this is really to start capturing how effective management is across overlapping designations. And in this case, what's really interesting, obviously, is the overlap with global geoparks. And one of the other things that we've started implementing is capturing Indigenous heritage values. We're only at the very beginning of this process. We're working together with the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage to try and provide more of a space for Indigenous peoples to share what World Heritage sites mean to them. And this is going to be a long process, and we've just started the dialogue process on that. So Outlook ultimately, based on this consistent methodology, is composed of two parts. On the left-hand side here, you can see the Outlook website. So this is where each individual site assessment is presented, and you can find all the details on the website. And so the whole assessment is laid out there for you to look at. The global report, on the other hand, really summarizes the information from these site assessments and provides an assessment of the global and regional trends that we can see based on the analysis of the site assessments. And so in the last cycle, we had 271 natural World Heritage sites that were assessed in the Outlook. And so these site assessments we call conservation outlook assessments, which provide a projection of whether a site is likely to maintain its World Heritage values and the associated key attributes over time. And as you can see, really the methodology focuses on these World Heritage values. So although we are able to capture the geoheritage values in sites that have not been inscribed for these, the assessment of these values does not impact the overall conservation outlook rating. And the outlook rating is composed of three components. The first is the state and trend of the World Heritage values. So here we look at a range of factors and in what condition the attributes are and give them a score of good to serious concern. The other component is the threats. So here we look at what current and potential threats a site is facing and what impacts they have on the values and attributes. And so threats are individually rated from very low to very high, and then there is an overall threat rating that's provided. And the last component is the protection and management. So we look at how effective protection and management really is in a site. And this is really complex. So there are over 18 subcategories, which again, each receive a score from highly effective to serious concern. And then there is an overall score for protection and management along the same grading scale. And these three components, so the state and trend of the values, the level of threats, and the effectiveness of protection and management feed into this overall conservation outlook that each site receives. So each site at the end has an overall rating for values, threats, protection and management, and then an overall conservation outlook rating, which ranges from critical, significant concern, good with some concerns, to good. And these individual site assessments are really developed building on an extensive consultation and review process. And I saw a few people that joined were part of this process, so it's a pleasure to see you all here again. But basically this entire process, it hinges on the involvement of a whole range of experts. In the last cycle, this involved more than 650 experts in total. And so what we do to start off with is really a desk-based analysis of what available information sources there are. We involve a range of knowledge holders also in capturing this information. And then we engage independent assessors that have extensive experience in the values of the site or the site itself, but have no personal connection to the site. And so they're independent. They then develop an initial site assessment, which then undergoes an entire peer review process of multiple reviewers that come from different backgrounds, different geographies, just to be able to provide this very neutral kind of development of a site assessment. We also have 2 rounds of feedback from site managers. So site managers receive the opportunity to provide input themselves, which has been very, very helpful and insightful in the last cycle, and basically incremental to ensuring that these site assessments are up to date and accurately reflect what's happening on the ground. Once we've received the input from site managers and the different reviewers, we also have regional review groups in the regions that you see on the slide. And this also involves not only the IUCN regional and country offices that are relevant, but also the regional vice chairs of the WCPA and SSC, so the World Commission on Protected Areas and the Species Survival Commission, and potentially also other experts where we need really specific input, for example, on a specific species. And so these regional review groups, again, go through the site assessments, look at potential proposed changes in conservation outlook ratings, provide their input, and then we're able to finalize the assessments and present these to the IUCN World Heritage Panel, which then makes the ultimate decision whether to approve or not. And so this is just to demonstrate that there's a whole entire consultation and review process that has to go through before a site assessment is in fact published on the website and accepted. So now the most interesting component of this talk, the key results. So I'll present some overall results from the latest Outlook, which we launched in October 2025 at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. As I mentioned, this captures overall 271 World Heritage sites. But there's also the subset of 228 sites that have been inscribed since 2014, where we now have all 4 data sets available and can compare directly across these sites. And then at the same time, I've done a little sub-analysis, which is only the beginning of a lot more work that we could do on the data that we have, for the results of the subset of sites inscribed under criterion 8, which is to be of outstanding examples representing major stages of Earth's history, including the record of life, significant ongoing geological processes in the development of landforms, or significant geomorphic or physiographic features. So that is what the World Heritage Convention calls criterion 8. And so in the last assessment in 2025, 98 sites of the 271 sites were inscribed under criterion 8. And so I will present the analysis of these 98 sites as a proportion of the 271 sites. When we look at the overall conservation outlook of all sites, so the 271 that were inscribed at the time of the analysis, almost 2/3 have a positive conservation outlook, so have been rated as good with some concern or good. And this is really similar to past outlook cycles. But when we start to focus on the sites that have been assessed since 2014 and where we can directly compare across the data, we've actually for the first time seen a significant decline in the percentage of sites with a positive outlook. So while 63% had a positive outlook, so good or good with some concerns, since 2014 to 2020, only 57% of these sites have a positive outlook now. So that is very concerning as an initial finding. And what I did is I looked at the proportion or the percentage of sites that have been inscribed for criterion 8 and how good they are faring in terms of their conservation outlook. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is the overall outlook changes in the criterion 8 sites. And on the right-hand side is the overview of all sites that you just saw on the previous slide. And what you can see is that the pattern is not the same. So for example, if you look at 2020, there was a decrease in 2020 of significant concern sites, or the proportion of sites that were rated as of significant concern, which is different than all the World Heritage sites. So this seems to indicate that more geodiverse sites, or sites that are recognized for their geoheritage, improved their outlook when compared to all sites in 2020. And in 2025, when we look at the criterion 8 sites, there was an increase in good with some concern sites compared to all the World Heritage sites, but a decrease in the good category. So this indicates that more criterion 8 sites have moved from good to good with some concerns in the last cycle than when we look at all World Heritage sites. So this kind of trend of decreasing positive conservation outlook seems to also be reflected in criterion 8 sites, but not as extreme, because currently the move is more from good to good with some concerns, whereas when we look at all World Heritage sites, there's much more of a migration towards significant concern. And this is really reflected across all regions. So across all regions, sites inscribed under criterion 8 do have a better outlook. So a greater percentage of sites have a good or good with some concerns conservation outlook when compared to all World Heritage sites. But this is not as meaningful of a graph because for regions with a small number of sites, for example, the Arab states, as you can see here, there's a really strong skew. So the difference looks much more significant. So the main kind of finding here is just to say that across all regions, the kind of perspective that we have that criterion 8 sites do have overall a better or more positive outlook is reflected across all regions. And the difference can, for example, also be reflected due to threats that a region is facing. So for example, in Africa, the major threat facing all World Heritage sites, which I'll explain later on, is hunting. And hunting does not, as such, directly impact the criterion 8 values and attributes as compared to some of the other criteria and their values and attributes. And when we move to looking at the status of which criteria are most affected, you can see here that the status of biodiversity values is of particular concern, and downward trends in values are growing. So the criteria 9 and 10 that you see here relating to ecological processes and to species and habitats continue to be more often assessed as of high concern or critical than values that are related to, for example, exceptional natural beauty, and also criterion 8 related to geology. So the situation for values recognized for their importance for species under criterion 10 really is the most concerning because it's continuing to deteriorate significantly, with only 52% of the values related to species and habitats assessed to be in a good state or of low concern in 2025. And in comparison, you can see here that criterion 8 actually has the lowest percentage of sites with a high concern or critical rating in terms of its values. Now, coming to the threats, these are the threats for all World Heritage sites when assessing outlook since 2014. And what you can see here is that the major threats have remained relatively consistent. They are climate change, invasive alien species, and unsustainable tourism. And the fastest growing threats, which I've circled here, are climate change and infrastructure developments, particularly recreation and residential areas, but also pathogens, which was a new finding in 2025. And when we look at the regional distribution of threats, what's important to note is that not all threats are equally distributed regionally. So there are regional differences that are important to note and also have ramifications for management. So climate change is the top threat in Asia, Europe, Mesoamerica, and the Caribbean, North America, and Oceania. But unsustainable tourism, for example, appears to be the greatest threat in South America, while hunting is the greatest threat in Africa. Although I wanted to do a regional kind of analysis of threats also for criterion 8 sites with so few sites in some regions, a regional threat analysis does not really provide significant results, as in the last slide. But I did tease out what the top 5 greatest threats are for all criterion 8 sites. And when you look at that on the left-hand side of your screen here, these do mirror the overall threats that all World Heritage, natural World Heritage sites are facing. But more interestingly, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, here we're looking at threats that have specifically been noted for affecting geoheritage values and attributes. So not just the overall site in which these attributes are found, but specifically the geoheritage attributes. And so what we can see here is that actually unsustainable tourism ranks the highest. And you can also see that waterborne and other effluent pollution appears amongst the top 3 threats, which was not the case when looking just more generally at the greatest threats for criterion 8 sites. So there is a slight difference in when you look at the analysis here, and I think the right-hand side is much more useful to consider. Coming to the protection and management, what we see here is that the protection and management in sites that are inscribed for their geological values appears overall more effective when compared to all World Heritage sites assessed in the 4th Outlook. So on the left-hand side is the pie graph that's showing the assessment for all natural World Heritage sites, and on the right-hand side for all the criterion 8 inscribed World Heritage sites. And so a greater percentage of sites is assessed as having effective management when inscribed for criterion 8 versus all sites. So 62% actually have effective management, so either highly effective or mostly effective when we look at the sites that are also inscribed for their criterion 8, while when we look at all the World Heritage sites, only 50% in fact have effective management. And breaking that down a little more, what we can see here are the protection and management aspects that were rated as serious concern most frequently. And what we can see is that when looking at all World Heritage sites and the subset of criterion 8 sites, sustainable finance really remains the key issue. But it's slightly less of an issue in criterion 8 sites. So 12% were rated as 12% of sites were rated as of serious concern when looking at sustainable finance, whereas for all World Heritage sites, this was 15%. So there is a slight difference in to what extent this is rated as a serious concern. And what's also interesting to note is that management effectiveness in addressing threats from outside site boundaries was of some more serious concern for 62% of all World Heritage sites and 50% of all the criterion 8 sites. And this issue has been increasing since the past outlook, so it's really one to look out for and to focus our management efforts on. We can also see that law enforcement appears as a top management challenge for all World Heritage sites, regardless of the criteria that they were inscribed for. At the same time, effectiveness of the management system in addressing threats inside the site does not seem to be as great of an issue for the criterion 8 sites when compared to all sites. And again, while staff capacity and management planning remain key issues across all the World Heritage sites, sustainable use and tourism management appear as greater issues for the subset of sites inscribed for under criterion 8. So again, interesting nuances to consider when looking at effective protection and management and improving that. And now when we look at the protection and management aspects rated most frequently as highly effective, again, we can see a lot of similarities, but also some key differences. So research, boundaries, education, and interpretation programs, as well as the integration into local, regional, and national planning systems, appear most often to be functioning well. But the legal framework does not appear in the top 5 highly effective protection and management categories for criterion 8 sites, while they do appear to have a better overall management system when compared to all World Heritage sites. So there's a lot to tease apart here, but what's important to note is that although there are a lot of similarities in regards to which aspects of protection and management are functioning well or not, there are some distinct differences from which we can learn. So just coming to the conclusions and next steps, and then hopefully we can have a nice discussion on these results. Several sites inscribed for their criterion 8 values have improved their conservation outlook between 2020 and 2025. So the sites that I have noted here with an arrow are ones that have been inscribed for due to criterion 8. In most cases, it's really the change has occurred because of a combination of factors, which has affected the overall conservation outlook. But just as a few examples, so Macquarie Island in Australia, here the pest eradication project has been highly successful and has led to a significant decrease in the threat from invasive alien species and a recovery of many of the essential attributes and values for which this site has been recognized for. In Chêne du Puy, there's an improved legal protection, the closing of quarries, and an updated management plan that has led to overall more effective protection and management, leading to an improvement in the overall conservation outlook. And in Pirin National Park in Bulgaria, again, the strengthening of the legal framework has contributed to more effective protection and management, and also a reduction in previously high threats like illegal logging, grazing, and infrastructure developments. And the enhanced effectiveness of protection management also supported the positive outlook trends for Plitvice Lakes National Park in Croatia, where monitoring has now also shown improvements in key attributes like the tufa dams and surface water quality. So really showing that the enhanced effectiveness in protection management and changes in the legal system have had a direct impact when it comes to monitoring the key attributes under the values for which the site has been recognized. So overall, sorry, this was quite an intense presentation, but I hope the conclusions kind of narrow down the key findings. So overall, sites inscribed under Criterion 8 do seem to fare slightly better in the conservation outlook. And it does appear that geological values and attributes are more robust compared to other values and attributes, especially related to biodiversity and ecosystems. At the same time, we saw that the sites are facing similar threats. So the subset of sites inscribed for their Criterion 8 values are facing similar threats as all World Heritage values. But again, when we look specifically at the threats that are affecting just the Criterion 8 attributes and values, there are slight differences, and it appears that unsustainable tourism is currently the top threat to these geoheritage values and attributes. And again, with management, we do see that there are similar management issues, but generally overall, it does appear that management is more effective in Criterion 8 sites than when looking at all natural World Heritage sites. And so just to give us a bit to kickstart off a discussion and to also hear your thoughts and experiences on some of these topics, I think what would be really interesting is to look at what lessons we can learn from management planning and addressing threats within site boundaries from Criterion 8 sites for other natural World Heritage sites. Another point, I think, we all know that geoheritage protection is really essential for biodiversity conservation and really underpins effective biodiversity conservation. But we could really look at that a bit more in detail, especially using the Outlook results. And in this case, for example, we could also look at a comparison of sites inscribed for both geodiversity and biodiversity criteria versus the sites that have only been inscribed for biodiversity criteria to see whether there's a difference in the conservation outlook. And I think that would be really interesting. Another thing, as I mentioned, is we're now looking more at multi-internationally designated areas. I saw my colleague Matilda is here in case we'd like to talk more about that as well. But we're really looking at how management is impacted by overlapping designations and how really overlapping designations can also improve the conservation outlook of sites. And so in this case, what would be really interesting to look at also from the outlook kind of perspective is looking at the conservation outlook, the protection and management issues and the threats that sites are facing specifically for World Heritage sites that are overlapping with UNESCO Global Geoparks. And one other thing where I have to give Jose and Dan in the audience all the credit is this kind of cluster around the climate change topics and really trying to enhance our understanding of climate change impacts and effective climate action. So really looking at geoheritage sites as a climate memory, learning from risk-based geoconservation frameworks, and also mapping vulnerability in refuge areas. So there's a lot that can be done in that space. And as I mentioned, considering that unsustainable tourism has been flagged as this key threat, especially on Criterion 8 attributes, it would be great to do more assessment into this to really understand what the impacts of recreational activities are specifically on attributes, and to develop appropriate management approaches, for example, utilizing the UNESCO Sustainable Tourism Toolkit. And then the last point that I was thinking about, it is concerning to see that issues around protection and management and addressing threats stemming from beyond site boundaries is becoming more and more of an issue. And this really shows that this kind of integration within the broader land and seascape is essential, and working together with other, not only Indigenous peoples and local communities, but also landowners, other sectors and beyond, and especially have political backing. And so really to look into how to effectively address the threats that are currently stemming from beyond site boundaries to improve the conservation outlook of sites that are suffering from increasing impacts is another thing that would be really interesting to